It's one thing to be told by the school at a meeting or being told orally, oh yeah, no, we can't provide that service. Oh no, we can't do that. Like I said, saying no is easy. Even at an IEP meeting, they'll say, no, we can't do that. But if you ask for prior written notice, it's a formal thing. They have to put in writing that they're denying your request and exactly why. That's a lot harder for them to do.
I'm Nicole Holcomb, attorney by day and podcaster by night, a former educator, school counselor, and administrator, and mom to a 9-year-old daughter with dyslexia, who loves all things Harry Potter, Minecraft, and science. A few years ago, she was identified with dyslexia, and our life seemed to turn upside down for a while, quite literally. I created the Dyslexia Mom Life Podcast to help you navigate the upside down journey of dyslexia. You got this. If you're wanting to thrive as a mom in this dyslexia journey, then you're in the right place. Let's get started. All right, we have Sabrina back with us to talk all about IEPs. And so we are in part 2 of the IEP Bootcamp. And we're going to talk a little bit about the anatomy of an IEP today, but we decided to pivot a little bit and give you some very tangible strategies to walk away with some action plans for you. So we've decided today to talk to you all about IEP goal writing. And in fact, Sabrina's put together a little workshop for you today all about IEP goal writing. So we're going to jump right in. Sabrina, thanks so much for being back on the show today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me back. This has been a lot of fun.
Well, I am just excited as usual to have you on the show, but I'm just, honored that you're here with us again. And I look forward to us talking more about IEPs and, we talked a little bit off air. Goal writing is so essential as the pieces of the IEP. And if someone's new to special education with dyslexia, or if someone's, been going to the table for an IEP and just going through the motions, goal writing is so essential for everyone. So I'm so delighted that you thought through that and created a little mini workshop for us. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Let's start off by talking about some strategy tips.
So I just put together a couple of strategy tips that, sometimes you forget about because they're kind of obvious, frankly. But anyway, I just wanted to remind everybody, make sure that you request the evaluations that you're going to go over at the IEP meeting. Request those 48 hours in advance so that you have a chance to review. It's really important that parents have the opportunity to review the proposed goals, the evaluations, make notations, come up with questions. It makes the meetings go more efficiently, and that way you're not caught unaware. So really put that in writing and request that the evaluations and the draft IEP or the proposed goals be sent to you 48 hours in advance. Then once you get those, review those goals, write down any questions you have. Again, as you're going through the goals, make sure they make sense to you. If you don't understand it, you don't want to sign anything. I mean, mark on the IEP some questions that you have so that it makes sense to you what your child is receiving. And then make sure
for a second. I was just going to say too, that's so important because, especially coming from an education background, we're so used to that, right? Like every day we have, especially for teachers that are in special education delivering services, they're so used to that being just a part of their process, just like maybe we check our emails, like it's just so second nature to them.
Exactly.
But if it's not to us, how can we as a parent monitor if we don't even understand what's written? So I love that piece of that advice as well.
Yeah. And here's a little attorney tip. Don't ever sign anything that doesn't make sense to you. So that's why you really need to understand what's going on. The other thing to look for is to make sure that all the proposed goals address every single area of need. Sometimes things get overlooked. So really pay attention to what areas of need your child has and make sure that there is a goal to address each one. If you don't see a goal on there, go ahead and draft additional goals that you think should be included in the IEP. There's no limit to the number of goals that you can write. So if you don't see something that's being proposed, go ahead and draft it. And, that way you can bring it up at the meeting. As far as, other tips, I would say make it a practice to record every meeting. Sometimes you don't remember what was said at the meeting, and it gives you that reference point to go back after the fact and listen, just to make sure that you understand everything. So I like to always advise my clients record every single meeting. And then finally, of course, don't sign anything. Don't sign anything other than the attendance sheet at the meeting. And I don't say that because I think the school is trying to pull the wool over your eyes at all. I say that because, again, you may need that time to go back and revisit the recording. Just look over things, maybe let things settle for a day or two and then revisit it. Make sure everything fully makes sense, that everything was covered, all your concerns were addressed, and then go ahead and sign if that's fine. If you don't feel like everything was addressed, you can reach out to the school and ask for an additional meeting, ask for clarification. You don't have to sign right away. And I actually recommend that people don't sign right away, just to give it some time to settle.
Yeah, that's some more advice. I like that as well. That is good, because I think I was reading somewhere earlier today how, you get into the IEP meeting and it's just jumping straight to the meat of things and jumping over things. And for parents,
exactly,
this is what we're going to do, but you're not fully understanding what, especially in an initial meeting where you're trying to figure out what's going on with your child. And then you're trying to understand what are the needs, how can the school address them? And so it's fine to take your time and to slow the meeting down and to ask questions along the way. I think that's important too, I know there's a lot of people around the table and you feel outnumbered many times at an IEP meeting because the school will bring everyone to the table who needs to be involved so that all the educators can be there to provide input, but also hear what the needs are so they can help address that. And that can feel a little, at the table, you can feel a little bit outnumbered, so to speak. And so I just want to encourage people to absolutely, take a breath if you need to. It's fine to ask questions. We want you to ask questions. And so,
yes,
your job is to listen and to understand and to ask questions. And I know sometimes it's hard to not feel intimidated, but you're there as your child's advocate, and not in like the legal sense, even though that's fine too, but really as in, your child best, where you're seeing those struggles, you're listening to what the school is seeing as struggles, and then you're on the team together.
Exactly.
As a partnership, trying to figure out how to best address those needs. And I think that's a good piece too, to think about, when you go to the meeting, that you really want to start off. And we talked about this, I think, a little bit in part one, as that partnership until it's at a point where it can't be, but really to hopefully everybody at the table wants what's best for your child. So
yes,
I think if everybody goes in with that kind of mindset, then it really does help have a productive meeting.
Yeah. And I'll add, don't feel rushed. Sometimes
Right.
people, they schedule these IEP meetings, an hour at a time. If you don't finish, if you don't have all of your questions answered and you don't feel good about, being heard or that you've covered everything and the end of that hour comes, it's okay to, ask for another session. The meeting's not over until you have all of your concerns and your questions answered. So, it's okay. If it doesn't finish in an hour, that's fine. Don't feel rushed into anything. You can continue the meeting at another time.
Right, exactly. So let's jump into the goal writing piece, because that's just so essential to this whole process, is making sure that we have the right goals written and we have the right pieces that are identified as the needs, matching those goals. And so when you think about goal setting and you think about services, what is one of the first things that you would tell parents to do? What do they need to be identifying before they even are thinking about goals?
Well, there's a common saying in special education that needs drive goals and goals drive services. So you have to be absolutely clear as to what your child's needs are. You need to identify those from your own observations, from teacher observations, through the psychoeducational evaluation that was done. You get to put in your input, the school and the rest of the IEP team, they put in their input. And from that, you can identify, what does my child need? And like I said before, make sure that each need has at least one goal that addresses it.
Right. And one of the things too, I know that we talked about a little bit as well, and it's pretty common knowledge for anyone that's ever even written personal goals, is what people call SMART goals. And if there's ever a time to use what's called a SMART goal, it is definitely in the IEP process. And as you think about what those needs are and matching those with a goal, at least one goal, I've seen a lot of goals over the years when working as a school counselor, and some of them were so broad that I was like, how would we ever even be able to it's so subjective, right? And so I think it's so important, that SMART goals piece. So can we, for those that may not be familiar with SMART goals, can we kind of walk through what that stands for and give them just a little bit of an example of those before we get into the actual goal writing pieces? Because I want them to be thinking about, what is a SMART goal? What should I be looking for as I'm looking, like you said, when they get the draft IEP or they get the draft information and they're looking over, here are some proposed thoughts from the school, or when they take that IEP home to look it over, do I see things that are measurable? What are the things I'm looking for? So I think that's an important place for us to start.
Sure. So SMART is an acronym. It stands for specific, measurable, attainable / appropriately ambitious, results oriented, and time bound. So those are the things that you need to be looking for as you're looking at the goals. So first of all, with specific, the goals need to have sufficient detail to know exactly what the goal states. It should target areas of academic achievement or functional performance, whatever your child's needs are. But overall, the bottom line is, what specific skill do you want to improve? You want to keep it very specific. You don't want a vague goal, because then that becomes very difficult to measure. The M is for measurable, and that's probably one of the most important parts. A goal must have an objective, not a subjective way to measure whether the child is meeting the goal or not. So ask yourself, can you observe or count it to know whether your child has met that goal? When a teacher says a student is making progress, that's the teacher's opinion based on subjective observations, and it may or may not be accurate. Grades are also not objective assessments of progress. There's a lot that goes into grades, including the student's effort, the teacher's subjective beliefs, student's attitude, grade inflation. That does actually happen. So you really want to be able to point to something that you can look at, you can feel it, you can count it, and it's not ambiguous in any way. So that's probably the most important part, I think.
I was thinking
too.
Goals. I was thinking too, when you were talking about goals, grades and measurable, I've seen even in some instances where part of a grade might even be a participation.
Exactly.
Like it can just be made, if you look at a syllabus, it can be made up of, and it will be made up of different sections. When you think about grades, some of it might be homework. So it does look a lot of different ways, even in different classes. So I think that's something to keep in mind.
Yes. And grades are pretty broad. If you're looking at your language arts grade, there's a lot that goes into that. Whereas with goals, again, being specific, you're looking to pinpoint a very, very specific skill set. And so the grade isn't an accurate measure of that particular skill set.
And if they're making progress on that skill set.
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
Yes.
Exactly. Which is the whole point of the goals.
Yeah.
Some progress.
Yes. Progress is important. So the A is for attainable. You want the goals to be attainable, obviously. You don't want to set up your child for failure. But at the same time, you want that goal to be appropriately ambitious. A lot of times school districts will draft goals that are pretty easy for students to attain. And that shows that the services are working. However, if it's not appropriately ambitious enough, how are you going to get your child caught up? That's usually, where we are with dyslexia. For example, you have a second grader who's reading at a kindergarten level, And, if the goal is to get them to progress one grade level, well, by the next year, they're still 2 grade levels behind. So that wouldn't be an appropriately ambitious goal. So you don't want goals that are so easy to attain that they are basically meaningless. And the goal should be results oriented. The desired result should be clearly stated and directly address your child's unique needs. What is it specifically that you want them to be able to do? And then finally, it should be time bound. The goal should have a date to achieve that goal. You should have a long-term goal, which is an annual goal typically. And then typically you also have short-term goals. And short-term goals are important because it's a way of measuring progress toward the long-term goals. It's, that way you don't have to wait an entire year to see if your child is making progress. You want to be checking it in at least, quarterly, just to make sure that they're kind of on track. And that way, if they're way off base, if they're not on track to meet their short-term goals, maybe that's a time that you can kind of course correct to see what could be improved so that they are meeting their goals.
Great. That's perfect. Thank you for running through SMART goals. I think that'll be helpful for people. And I'll also, for those of you that are listening, I'll include, some of this information as well in the show notes. So if you're driving or running or whatever you're doing, and I know you probably want to be taking some notes, but I will spell out the SMART goals and give you some examples of, those as well. So that will help, those that are listening and not able to take notes right now. So as we move into, we talked about SMART goals. And so that's so important to know what kind of goals should I be thinking about we should be writing as a team. But we talked about a few minutes ago about really the needs driving the goals. And so when you think about the needs, we have to talk about, I think what's referred to anyway, is the present levels of performance. So can we talk a little bit about that before we get into some examples of actually drafting some goals?
Yeah, sure. So it's really important to understand that you cannot begin to draft goals until you know exactly what your child can do right now. You have to know the present levels of performance. And the present levels should be just as specific as the goals and directly related to them. So present levels of performance describe what your child can do right now. It is a baseline. It should be based on objective data that shows what your child knows. And it must be accurate and it must be current. Oddly enough, I've seen several present levels that are based on information from 2 or 3 years ago. So they need to be current, and they just really focus on them being specific. They need to address a particular thing. Otherwise, you really can't draft a goal.
Right. Because you're not able to determine where your child is currently.
Yes.
To determine what are those needs to know what those services are. So that makes perfect sense. And so
Exactly.
Some of those as well, you would recommend those be based on some type of academic testing or evaluations or something that are more valid and standardized or when you think about those pieces?
Yeah, they need to be objectively verified.
Mm-hmm.
It's not good enough really to even say, oh, my child reads at a first grade level. Mm-hmm. Well, what does that mean? There's a lot that goes into that. Mm-hmm. It should be very, very specific.
Necessarily teacher tests. We're talking more about Lexile scores or end of the year testing or third year benchmark testing for third grade, things like that.
Yes. Yeah. Standardized tests, or in the case of an initial IEP, the actual evaluation results themselves. They should be able to tell you if you're going to have a spelling goal, they should be able to tell you exactly what your child can spell right now, at what level, which words, things like that. And so that's what you want to base your goals on. You need to have the baseline for that.
So we're looking at things that are reliable and valid. Right.
Something, again, that is tangible, something that can be counted. And ideally at the meeting, you'd be able to see it, like the teacher or, the resource teacher would be able to pull up a list of the words with the markings on it so that you can see exactly which ones your child knows and which ones they don't.
Right. Absolutely. All right. Well, let's jump into actually, I believe you've got some things prepared for us today as far as giving some examples and explanations and kind of walking through an example of what a goal could look like and helping us to identify, is it a SMART goal and what can we do to make it a better goal?
Sure. Yeah. So it's really easy to sit here and say, oh, you should draft SMART goals. But what does that look like in the real world? Especially when emotions are high, you're frustrated, you're stressed,
Yes.
what does it look like? So I just wanted to give some examples. So if we take the example draft goal here, student will decode unfamiliar words with 80% accuracy using teacher prompts as measured by teacher observation. And we assume here that the baseline is 40%. Now, what is wrong with this goal? I mean, it sounds to the, most parents, oh, okay, well, we're going to decode unfamiliar words, higher than we are now. Okay, great. But what's wrong with this goal?
I think something that jumps out to me too is that it's teacher observation.
Yes.
So how's she coming up with that? Where is she writing down her data points, things like that?
Sure, exactly.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So what I think is wrong here with this goal is, one, it's not specific. We're talking about decoding unfamiliar words. Well, what words are those? How many of them? What grade level are we talking about? It's also not measurable, because who determines what unfamiliar words are? How many times does the student need to perform this task with 80% accuracy? The other problem with it, as you pointed out, is teacher observation isn't measurable by itself, and it is therefore inherently subjective. So sometimes you may see measured through formal or informal assessments as the measure of the goal. But again, what does that mean? What is an informal assessment? So you need to specify the words, and it is best to attach the words to the IEP so everyone's on the same page. That's what I like to do.
I was just about to ask you that, because I was thinking if they said verbally, well, this is how we're going to test, you want that actually written in that legal document so there's no confusion in the future as to what we agreed to, right?
Yeah, exactly. What words? What are we talking about here specifically? And the other problem with this goal is I don't know that it's attainable or appropriately ambitious, because we don't really know what this goal is measuring. Because it's so vague, we don't know if that's appropriately ambitious or if it's even attainable. The other thing that stood out to me with this one is the inclusion of teacher prompts. To me, that is problematic, because what does that mean? Does that mean that the teacher prompts the student with the answer? It could, right. We don't know what that means. So if you're going to include a prompt, I think you need to be very, very clear as to what that means, or take it out, because the ultimate goal would be that your child can perform this task independently, right? Again, this goal, it's not particularly results oriented, because we don't really know what we're even measuring, and it is not time bound. When will the student need to achieve this goal? I think it's implied that it would be by the next annual IEP meeting, but we really don't know. So that needs to be specified.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want, we can go through how I would correct this.
Yeah, I think that would be great, because I'm right there with you looking at this. It'll be probably more familiar to people once they're able to see the show notes to see those words. But I think just listening to is so helpful, because just thinking through, even when you were talking about unfamiliar words, the thing that I thought about too was that it doesn't even say 20 unfamiliar words. There's no number that's even attached to that. So I think it would be great if you, can go through some examples there of these are if I were working with you, this is how I would correct this, or this is how I would advise you to go in and ask for these pieces so that they are now actual SMART goals. So that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah. So if I were going to redraft this goal, I would have it read by February 2021 or the next annual review date, student will independently read at least 33 out of 41 Dolch third grade sight words in 2 of 3 consecutive trials as measured by teacher charted data. And we would want to include here, again, you can't write a goal without a proper baseline.
Right.
We would want to know that currently the student can independently read, for example, 16 out of the 41 Dolch third grade sight words.
And before you move on, can I just point out too something that's I think is important for people to know? I love the baseline is so specific because the 16 out of 41, we're talking about an annual review, but like you were saying, even quarterly, if at the next quarter you only had 17, then what do we do? Do we need to do something different or sit for another quarter? So I think that in and of itself is also very helpful because you can see we've got a goal of 33. We're at 16. We're in the middle of the year. We're, 1 quarter left. Like how is the progression looking as far as meeting that goal? And you can't do that with the previous goal, but you can do that with this one. Yeah,
exactly. And there's no ambiguity. We know that the child can read 16. And we know exactly what we're measuring, and we want to get them to 33 at least. And that's something that can be verified. You can look at the teacher charted data. You can see the list, what they got right, what they got wrong. You can see all of that. So it is really specific. We want the child to independently read a certain number of words off of a very specific word list. So that, it's super specific. It is measurable because we know the student will independently read a certain number of words and how the data will be recorded. We can also see the list and the teacher's notations. It does not include teacher prompts because I'm not a fan of that, but it makes it for a more accurate and specific goal. You're dealing with a finite number of words. The student is currently at 40% accuracy if you do the math. And we want to get them to at least 80% accuracy. But rather than using percentages, we're being very, very specific by saying a certain number of words. It is results oriented because we know exactly what results we're looking for. We want to see at least 33 of the 41 Dolch words. There is no ambiguity here. It is time bound. We now have an end date by which we want to see the student achieve the goal. And we've also revised the baseline to make more sense. We can only rewrite this goal because we have this baseline. So that's another thing to watch for when you're looking at goals. The baseline may be, the kid can only read unfamiliar words with 40% accuracy. Well, but that's not a good enough baseline for this goal. So you may actually need somebody to go back and reevaluate the child to see how many of these third grade Dolch sight words they can read so that you have an accurate baseline from which to craft the goal.
That makes perfect sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So, once you have your annual goal drafted, then you can start breaking it down into quarterly goals or other short-term goals so you know that your child is making progress. So if you're starting at 16, the first quarter goal might be 25 of those 41 words. And then quarter 2 is going to be, 30 or, however you want to divide it up based on what's going on with your school and where you are in the academic year. But if you don't have an accurate long-term goal, then you really can't break it down into measurable short-term goals.
Right. Absolutely. Now, when we think about, those goals being just so specific to where we want to see, where we want that end result to be in a year, and as we want to see continued progress toward, those reading goals, and we didn't talk about this prior to this, but where does the whole remediation piece fit in? Are those going to fit in more of the services pieces that go along with the goals as far as, how it's delivered or, how many sessions a week I get in addition to the regular class? What are some pieces there you recommend for parents as they're trying to figure out, how do I go about getting the services I need to make sure the goals are met? Does that make sense?
Sure.
Especially as it relates to dyslexic kids.
Yeah. So we've gone over needs drive goals. Goals drive services. So once you have pinpointed your child's weaknesses, the things that they need to work on, and you have goals now that are appropriately ambitious and properly crafted, then the next step is, okay, well, how are they going to achieve those goals? What are we going to do so that those goals will be met? And that is services. So this is another reason why you need to have goals that are very specific and appropriately ambitious, because you don't want to just keep getting passed from grade to grade to grade and with really not catching up. I gave the example before about reading at kindergarten level, but being in the second grade. You don't want to just make 1 year's progress, because then in third grade, you're still 2 grade levels behind.
Right.
So once you have a good goal drafted, that's where you start talking about services. And the more ambitious the goal, the more services you're probably going to need. If you're going to go from, say, a baseline, I'll just say 10% for a particular goal, and you want to get to 80, you're going to need, a significant amount of services to get you there. So really, once you have the goals drafted, that's where you come in and start negotiating about services to address those very specific goals, the very specific needs that your child has. And it's not a one-stop shop. Just because the school offers you 30 minutes 2 times a week of resource time, that may not be appropriate for your child's needs. You have to make sure that that amount of service is actually going to help them reach their goals. And don't think of it as a take it or leave it. It's what the school is offering to you is a jumping off point for negotiation. It's a first offer. So consider it. It may be perfectly fine. It may not be, but don't feel intimidated or afraid to come back and say, I don't know if that's enough. I think we need to see 30 minutes 4 times a week. It's okay to ask for that. And it is a discussion between you and the rest of the IEP team. It's not a take it or leave it. So please always keep that in mind.
Yeah, right. And I think too, when we were talking about a few minutes ago, when you're thinking about those pieces, especially the services, one is I think about the severity of your child's dyslexia, and you'll get that from your evaluation, how severe is it as to what is the psychoeducational or what is the private evaluation, saying your child needs to be able to catch up. So you're not constantly behind, but you're actually trying to close that gap. And yes. I know we talked about this in part 1, we're not in this to try to push you one direction or the other, but we're in this to make sure that you're educated. But also I think that's why it's so important to reach out to an advocate, especially an advocate that might be familiar with your district and what is available and just familiar with dyslexia in general, because, you may walk into that meeting and it sounds fine. But if you had consulted with an advocate, even if you went on your own, if you had consulted with an advocate, they could have said, you know what, once a week is not going to be enough. You're not going to make enough progress for your child. You're going to need, with your child's severity level, probably at least 3 or 4 times a week at X amount of times a setting. Well, if you're new to dyslexia, you might not know that that's what your child needs. And so you may, I think you kind of tongue in cheek laughed about this in the first one, as far as your IEP experience. But if you don't know, then you don't know the right questions to ask. So I do think it's important to be thinking about, what is your level of competence? How comfortable do you feel? Your child is struggling, but do you really know all of the services that are available? And sure, someone in a Facebook group can give you their, mom opinion, but if you talk to someone that can say, okay, but this is what you need to say to them, and it is perfectly reasonable for you to ask for 4 times a week, and the district to have that conversation. And so I just don't want, I appreciate you saying that, because I don't want people to say, oh, well, this is what's written down, so this is what they're offering, and I guess I'll accept it, or I'll have to get private tutoring. Yeah, you may have to, but that's not where you should just give up and stop. If you need to push
Exactly.
a little harder, or to come back and have another conversation, or just to go home and sleep on it, like you said earlier, that's perfectly fine. But it's so important that, if you're not educated with all those pieces, you really don't know what is available. Right. And you
Yes,
don't know always what's available in your district and what they are already utilizing. You could be at one school, and a school 10 minutes from your house could be offering something else that your child actually would be better
exactly.
fit. They're not going to say, hey, we'll send you over to so-and-so school. But if you can't meet my needs here, I'd like to be transferred to XYZ school, just as an example.
That's right. Consulting with somebody ahead of time is worth its weight in gold. Just to know, like you said, what services are available. What do you think my child is going to need? If you don't know, how much intervention your child's going to need based on what their needs are or the severity of their dyslexia, you need to talk with somebody who does know, because it makes the process, again, go so much more efficiently, and you're always better off getting the right goals and the right services from the get-go. Because with dyslexia, the earlier the intervention, the better it works. So you don't really have time on your side, so it's best to get it done right the first time.
Absolutely. So having said that, what happens if I'm at the IEP and I don't agree with what the rest of the team is saying? Maybe I don't agree with the goals, and I'm saying, no, this is not a SMART goal. This is not measurable. This is just very subjective, and you're just unhappy with the goals that the team has created. Is there anything that I can do?
Yes, definitely. I just want everybody to keep in mind that you as the parent are an equal and very important member of the IEP team. Just because you may be outnumbered at the table deciding on what's included in your child's IEP is not a majority role. I.e., you cannot be outvoted. Okay. So what do you do if you don't like what the school is proposing? So the best thing the parents can do really is to ask clarifying questions. Ask questions about the goals. How will the goal be measured? What does this goal mean? How will I know if my child is making progress? Why do you think this goal is appropriate for my child? What does this look like in the classroom? That's a question that I ask a lot at IEP meetings. They may go through the goal and it's like, okay, well, that sounds great, but what does that look like in the classroom? And, just ask for examples, ask them to explain, and keep asking questions until you get all of your questions answered, until you fully understand what the goal is targeted towards and you understand what's going to happen, what this looks like in practice in the classroom. If the school disagrees with some of the goals that maybe you have proposed, I would be asking, like, what part of the goal that I wrote do you disagree with? Why? Why is that not appropriate? And, just keep asking those questions, because again, as parents, we're not educators, most of us anyway, and there may be a valid reason why the goal that you have crafted isn't appropriate for your child. And so ask for that clarification, because then you can get to the reasons behind it, and maybe together you can come up with a goal that is a better reflection of what your child's true needs are. Let's see here.
And I think too, Sabrina, I'm sorry to interrupt. Sometimes too,
Mm-hmm.
I hear moms say, well, the picture at school sometimes looks different than the picture at home. And maybe also if there's goals that the school's not in agreement with, I think you even said this prior, is that, sharing what you see at home. And I think if I remember correctly, in the first part, you talked about keeping a journal or a notebook or something to write down some notes, because it's very helpful at the meeting. If the teacher thinks the homework should take 15 minutes and you say for the last 3 weeks, your homework has taken an hour and a half, and the teacher's like, wow, I had no idea. That's some powerful data that you can bring in and share with the team that they don't know unless you share with them. So I think things like that are very powerful as well.
Yes. And so you really should. You should share your concerns about the goals as drafted, bring in your own data to back up your position. Like you just mentioned, homework's supposed to take, 15 minutes, but your child, it takes an hour and a half and they end in tears and there's a fight and, objects are being thrown across the room. That's not healthy and that's not good. And that's not something that your teacher can see. So if you keep records of this stuff and bring that with you to the IEP, then you can, share that with the rest of the group and they can go, oh my gosh, that's awful. Let's come up with a solution to address that. So don't be afraid to share what you see at home. Don't be afraid to share whatever data you have to support your position. Tell the team why you don't think their goal is appropriate or why your version is better. You're not being difficult by doing that. It's a negotiation. It's a discussion. So they tell you what they see at school. You should tell them what you're seeing at home and try to come to a consensus for how to address your child's needs.
And so what happens if we can't? What if we just come to an impasse and we just agree to disagree? Is that it? Is that all a mom can do at that point? Or is there another avenue even after sharing your concerns and your disagreement with the goals?
Yeah. So sometimes, unfortunately, you really are truly at an impasse. And what you should do at that point is you should send a confirming letter or email to the IEP team after the meeting. And you need to set out your concerns that you raised at the meeting, what your proposed solution was, what the IEP team's response was, and then one of the best tools a parent has is to request prior written notice. Now, what prior written notice is, it's covered under the IDEA. If you ask, the school must provide you with written notice setting forth your request, that they are denying your request, and why they're denying your request. So I don't know if you're all familiar with Wright's Law. Pete Wright, he's a fabulous resource. If you haven't checked out Wright's Law, you should. And Pete Wright always says, it's easy saying no, but coming up with reasons why they say no and then documenting it makes it a lot harder for them to say no to what your child needs. So it's one thing to be told by the school at a meeting or being told orally, oh yeah, no, we can't provide that service. Oh no, we can't do that. Like I said, saying no is easy. Even at an IEP meeting, they'll say, no, we can't do that. But if you ask for prior written notice, it's a formal thing. They have to put in writing that they're denying your request and exactly why. That's a lot harder for them to do. And you will either get what you wanted in the first place, or the school will have to explain its denial. And at that point, you have the documentation to use in a due process complaint if you have to move forward with that. If the school just ignores your request for prior written notice, that's something that you can file a compliance complaint with your Department of Education. If you're at that point, it's probably a good idea to consult with an advocate or an attorney to take it further. But at least you are doing your due diligence, papering the file. You have a written explanation of why the school is denying your request. And then you can take that to an advocate or an attorney, and they can evaluate how best to proceed.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. That's helpful because I think that unfortunately, many times, especially with dyslexia, parents are faced with that dilemma. Let me just say that. But, I love how you couched it earlier. I think this is a good way to kind of summarize part 2, which is, those needs that your child has is going to absolutely drive and should drive the goals that are created by the team. And then those goals that are created that are SMART goals are then driving the services. And I would think as well, the accommodations that need to be put in place.
Yes.
So everything's being driven by those goals, and each of the needs that your child has is being addressed with a SMART goal. So
yes.
I think that's a great place for parents to start and for moms to start. This has been great. I love part 2. I love talking about goal writing and SMART goals. I could talk about SMART goals all day. Actually, I love SMART goals, but I'm sure at this point people are like, wow, that was a lot to take in. Again, we will absolutely include these pieces in the show notes and make sure that that's, easy for you to find. If you're at a point where you're like, you know what, I just need someone to help kind of walk me through that. We've got some amazing resources at our website with Dyslexia Mom Life. Sabrina's got excellent resources as well. We will link to both of those. If you need to reach out and get an advocate, reach out to Sabrina, reach out to me. We both have resources. And if you need a referral to someone local, we've got those as well, because we want you to make sure that you have what you need and that you feel comfortable and competent and you're ready to go, because those IEP pieces are just so important for your child to be successful, to be able to thrive with dyslexia and to be able to really get, I don't want to say get past, because you're never going to get past the dyslexia piece. It's just part of who your child is, which is an amazing part of your child, but the whole remediation process and going through that journey is going to make progress move a little bit smoother if you've got those really strong SMART goals. So Sabrina, I so appreciate you being here and sharing goal setting. Is there any last bits of advice you have for parents on goal setting before we wrap up part 2?
I would just go back to ask questions. Yes. Questions are your very, very, very best tool at an IEP, and just keep asking those questions until you get the answer. So don't be afraid to open your mouth and ask questions. There are no dumb questions at an IEP meeting.
Absolutely. If you don't know, then ask. Absolutely. Well, thank you again for your time and for putting together this workshop. It's been amazing. And I can't wait to talk in part 3. We're going to be talking about types of IEP meetings, the annual IEP meeting. And right now we're going to talk about, in that part 3, talking about distance learning and compensatory education as it relates to COVID. So I look forward to getting back with you and sharing some more information in our IEP Bootcamp. So thank you so much, Sabrina.
Thank you so much for having me.
Today's show notes can be found at dyslexiamomlife.com/episode 58. Next week, we will be finishing up our 3-part series on our IEP Bootcamp, and Sabrina and I will be talking about the annual IEP and progress monitoring. We're also going to be spending some time talking about what to do when there's regression and how to go about requesting compensatory education. In these times of COVID, we're also going to talk about some specifics around COVID and how you can get additional resources as well. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you won't miss any of the great episodes we have planned for 2021. Have a great week. I will see you here next Monday. And remember, you got this.